What's up? My name is John O, and today, boys and girls, we're getting into the specifics of EQ, starting with how to EQ a kick drum in just 30 seconds. Here's a recording of a live kick drum. It's a pretty good representation of what you normally get live. And the clock starts now. Sounds pretty good to me. I'm gonna start by explaining what I look for when I'm EQing my kick, and I'll show you where to find it in your EQ. Then I'll explain how I vary my EQ depending on the type of kick I get or the type of song I'm mixing. This way you know exactly how to apply this stuff when you're mixing. I'm also gonna limit myself to just 4 EQ points because that's usually the limitation of most live consoles or most basic EQs. And I want to show you that that shouldn't stop you from getting a really great sounding EQ. The first thing I start with is my EQ point 1 in a bell shape. I usually go for a generous boost at about 40 to 50 Hz with a medium Q. This boost is what drives the subs. I decide how much I want to boost based on how much of that thump in my chest I want in my mix. This boost will cause a buildup of boomy resonance in the neighboring frequencies, usually at about 100 Hz. I use EQ point 2 to cut right there. I decide how wide or narrow my Q is depending on how boomy I want the kick to be in my mix. If you're listening on basic earphones, you might not be able to hear a lot of what I'm doing with EQ point 1 and 2, but try it with a proper system or in a live system with subs, and I promise the difference is huge. Next, I skip ahead to EQ point 4 and boost in a bell shape at about 4 to 5K to highlight the sound of the kick beater hitting the kick drum skin. Without this, the kick sounds like mostly lows, and boosting these highs in the kick is what helps to glue the kick with the rest of the instruments in the mix. I decide how much to boost based on how bright I want the kick to sound, and I decide how wide or narrow my Q is based on how much cymbals there are bleeding into the kick mic. If the kick drum signal is pretty clean like this one, then the Q can be a medium Q. But if there's a lot of cymbal bleed, then I'll narrow my Q to capture as little of the cymbal bleed as possible. Bear in mind, when I'm EQing a kick on its own like this, I tend to have EQ point 4 a little bit higher than I think sounds just right. Because this is gonna disappear once I bring in all the other instrumentation in the mix, like vocals, keys, guitars, etc. And lastly, I use EQ point 3 to trim the unwanted fat in the kick so that we're left with just tasty meat. I cut between these two EQ points with a wide Q. There's usually nothing very pleasant here, and this is what gives the kick drum a knocky sound. Now I'm gonna explain the variables to you. EQ point 1 is what makes your kick sound big. If you boost this too far in a live venue, you might cause feedback in your subs, and I counter this by gating my kick. I'll get into gates in future videos. If I'm mixing something like an acoustic track, then I won't boost this too much because I'm going for a not so heavy sound. And of course, I mentioned in past videos that it also depends on the kind of kick patterns that the drummer is playing. A heavy boost doesn't work too well for genres like metal or gospel, where the drummers tend to play lots of busy kick patterns. EQ point 2 determines how boomy the kick drum is. If the drummer is playing slower tempo music, then a little bit of this boom tends to work quite well to extend the decay or length of each kick drum, which makes the low end feel nice and big. Whereas if the drummer is playing a faster tempo song, then I will cut this further to tighten up the kick and reduce the decay of the kick so it doesn't feel like the kicks are bleeding into each other. I'll come back to this later. EQ point 3 is generally what determines how true to the original signal the kick drum sounds. If you cut this, you'll get a more unnatural studio style sounding kick drum, which works really well for modern ears. Whereas the reverse will give you a more acoustic sounding kick drum. EQ point 4 determines how much the kick's highs cut through the mix. If I'm mixing an upbeat, faster tempo song, then I tend to have a generous boost here. Whereas if I'm mixing a more ambient, down-tempo song, then I boost this just enough so that I glue my kick with the rest of my mix, but not so much that the kick sticks out of the mix. Now, I've mentioned different EQ approaches for different styles of music or different tempos. So what do we do if the drummer is changing styles throughout the set? A great example of this is your typical praise and worship set in a contemporary church, where you usually have 1 or 2 fast songs or praise songs and then 3 or 4 slower songs or worship songs. Here's what I do. For my faster songs, I cut EQ point 2 to tighten up the kick, and I boost EQ point 4 to help the kick cut through the highs and high mid information in the faster songs. And there's usually a huge amount of highs and high mids for the kick to fight with in the tracks. And for the slower songs, I make the cut in EQ point 2 less drastic to make the kick larger and more boomy. And I make my boost in EQ point 4 less drastic to help the kick blend in better with the instrumentation. Because usually the slower songs have less high mid and high information than the faster songs. One final note, the sound check is when I'm looking to set my frequency and cue for each of these EQ points. That way, during this set, if I need to make any changes, the only thing I'm changing is the gain on any one of these EQ points, rather than distracting the audience by sweeping wildly through my EQ looking for what I need. Make sense? To prove how easy it is to apply this on any kick drum, I'm going to start from scratch with 2 totally new kick drums and EQ them again in just 30 seconds. Not bad, right? And here's the last one. I hope that's been a very thorough how-to and you guys are feeling confident with your kick EQ. Here's a cheat sheet to help you remember everything we've covered today. You can pause the video and save a screenshot of this for future reference. Next week, we're going to look at how to EQ your bass to fit with the kick EQ we just learned today. I'm John O. Don't forget to subscribe for more.